there's been a lot of discussion today and throughout the year about just the sheer amount of craft brands available to consumers right now, and whether or not drinkers might one day get a little bit tired of all that choice and eventually stick to a core stable of familiar brands. It's unclear if or when consumers will reach that point of oversaturation. The Brewers Association has argued that there's still plenty of run room for craft, pointing to Nielsen statistics that show 58% of American craft beer drinkers are craving more flavor options. And at the same time, many companies are beginning to rationalize SKUs, responding to retailer requests to simplify their portfolios. Nevertheless, the fact that so many drinkers are, for the time being, willing to experiment with new craft offerings should only be welcomed by the entrepreneurs in this room today, who might be considering new product introductions, line extensions, or completely new brand entries. But, as the saying goes, just because you can doesn't mean you should. There's an art to bringing multiple brand identities to the market simultaneously, and there are very serious considerations that brand owners should make before they decide to take this approach. So, here today to discuss what it's like to balance multiple brand identities is Tomme Arthur, the co-founder of the Lost Abbey, Port Brewing, and the Hop Concept. Over the years, Tomme has demonstrated an ability to respond to consumer demands with a variety of well-differentiated brand personalities. And through that process, he's learned what's required to manage a portfolio of individual identities and how that approach changes as his company continues to grow, and how that changes how his company operates. So Tomme, come on up to the stage. Our resident local speaker, Tomme Arthur.
Local speaker. Oh, look at my microphone's even live. I have to set my beer down, which is sad. I'm sorry, Carl. All right, so Chris just gave me a hell of an introduction, and I apologize because I'm really not that smart at this, but we represent 3 brands these days, and when Chris and I were discussing what it is that we do, we discussed at length how it is that we've been in the business of selling beer for 10 years, and in those 10 years, how is it that we came to have 3 brands? It's an interesting story. I'm not sure that it's as compelling as I might like to think it is, but it basically starts with this premise, and the premise is that I firmly believe we are actually in the business of creating brands, and we use the brewing process as the vehicle for building our business. So the business of beer for me and for my partners, and what it is we do at Port Brewing, the Lost Abbey, and now the Hop Concept, is that we are in the business of building brands. So let me make sure I get this thing going. All right, so how did we come to be in this situation? So I've been in the beer business for 20 years. In the fall of 2005, my partners, Vince Marsalia, his sister Gina Marsalia, who's sitting out here, myself and a 4th partner created Port Brewing and the Lost Abbey. And at that point, we knew that the Lost Abbey was a completely new brand that was going to come to market, and we were going to create some beers under this Port Brewing umbrella, which came from my work at Pizza Port and their work as the owners of Pizza Port. What does it mean in theory that we were not going to be a volume-based brewery? Well, we knew when we put our business plan together in the fall of 2005 and set our sights on opening the doors in 2006 that we were not going to be a 6-pack based business. We were not going to chase grocery channel style of selling beer. Volume was not going to be the key driver. So we set up the brewery to have 2 brands at that time, the Port Brewing brand and the Lost Abbey brand. And both of them hadn't really been truly in the market. So we got a chance to differentiate those 2 things and achieve a very, very good synergy between the 2. And that synergy allowed us to open up our doors and create sort of the early years and has launched us towards what we are operating as today. At that time, in 2006, when we opened our doors, there were less than 25 breweries operating in San Diego. If you fast forward to today, there are over 120 or 130, depending upon which one closed since we've been here this morning, and which one opened as well. And I'd like to point out that at that time, the largest brewery in town was the Stone Brewery, and they were about 40,000 barrels of beer. We took over their original brewery space, but the largest brewery in town was 40,000 barrels 10 years ago. If you think about what the San Diego beer market has become, it's incredibly fascinating to think that 10 years ago, the largest brewery in town was maxed out at 40,000 barrels and needed a new facility, and that's how we came to have our space. So Chris asked me to give you a little bit of the kind of classic beer thing. This is the 6-pack of lessons that I have personally sort of learned over the years and wanted to share with you today. On the left side are the lessons, on the right side are sort of my notes. So my lessons, and we're going to go through them in my slides. Walk before you run. Well, unfortunately for us, we were very ambitious when we opened our doors, and I think we ran before we walked. So a little bit about that as we come forward. Luck be a lady. It was very impressive when we launched our Lost Abbey brand of beers that we actually lucked into finding an artist who has been with us since day one. His name is Sean Dominguez. Thank God for Sean D. It's important because he gave us an enormous brand equity and a sense of artistic impression that still is with us today. 10 years ago when we opened up, every brewery, and even today, every brewery has a story. We now represent 3 different stories, and we're going to talk about how we deal with that. Number 4, fresh, local, or both. Everything in the business today is fresh, local, and how do you manage fresh, local, and both? Well, we now have hop concept, and we're going to talk about what that means to our storytelling. Number 5, storytelling is hard. The slide actually says later storytelling is fucking hard because it really, really is. It became very imperative or very obvious in the last couple of years that one of the biggest challenges we face with respect to having multiple brands and the stories that we need to convey is that we opened our doors as a highly storytelling backstory brand. The Lost Abbey brand specifically carries an enormous amount of gravitas with respect to how those beers came to be. But if you need to get a sales rep who didn't work for that distributor a year ago to remember your story, it's very challenging these days because they also have 50 other stories that they need to remember. So asking a sales rep to regurgitate or to speak to your brand when you now have 3 of them is even more difficult. So one of the things that we've looked at is how can we make the storytelling more simplistic. And then I guess the last one is that being nimble for 3 brands sometimes feels suicidal. At least it does for me because I'm in charge of sort of the art direction and the storytelling for all of them. And this year alone, we've gone through 2 major refreshes of the 3 brands. So those are my 6-packs. We'll talk about each one of those. So how is it that we came to walk before we ran? Well, we opened our doors with 2 brands. We knew that when we opened the doors, 2 brands were going to be part of our ability to compete in the market. We had the port brands, which were sort of West Coast in sort of their influence, and we were going to operate the Lost Abbey line of beers, which we were calling Belgian-inspired or Belgian-influenced. When we opened our doors, this sense of West Coast, Belgian-inspired, and even barrel-aged beers was pretty, I won't say nouveau, but it was pretty interesting at the time. If you fast forward to today, damn near every brewery that's sending out a press release to Brewbound says the same thing. We're going to open up with West Coast style hoppy beers, New England style beers in that case. We're going to have barrel-aged beers, Belgian beers, and sour things. So our ability to differentiate in 10 years' time has become quite challenged because what we opened up with seemed like a very strong position at the time, but it has changed. We also need to represent that the beer market in San Diego has grown and leaps and bounds. We are now one of the third, I believe, the 3rd largest share categories in the United States in terms of beer being sold in this town. And what does that mean to us as a small brewery? We opened our doors in 2006. We quickly grew to about 6,500 barrels of beer by year 3. And for a long time, we were one of the larger breweries in town. Today, I think we're about the 12th or 13th largest brewery in town, and we don't care if it's 15 by next year because we've never been interested in volume. But what that does mean now is what is our relationship to our largest wholesale partner, Stone Distributing Company, and what does it mean with respect to other breweries in town who have since gone past us in terms of size and potentially share of mind. So our distributor conditions have changed quite drastically since we opened our doors. And that includes other territories that we're in. So we're still not a volume-based brand. Today we're 15,000 barrels of beer total. We've been 15,000 barrels of beer for the last 3 years. We're still currently, although it's about to change, doing all single bottle format, so 12 ounce in the form of a 375, 22 ounce, and 750 milliliter cork finished bottles. Ambitious? Yeah, hell yeah, it was ambitious the way we opened our doors with 2 brands. Because we had to open up with all new labels, story, websites, all the work, and basically create 2 things from scratch. So it says #.com. Seemed like a good idea at the time, and it's been a pretty good idea, but it's more challenging today than it's ever been to tell your story. So one of the original lessons was how do you walk before you run? So we tried to set up the brands. Port Brewing was very West Coast centric. It basically was going to be around an IPA, a double red ale, and a dark strong ale. Those were the 4 bottles that we were going to represent. Again, all 22-ounce formatting. And basically the premise was that they were going to be hand sold. The distributors could wrap their fingers around basically 4 things, and we weren't looking for lots of placements in high grocery channels and things like that. There was not a lot of velocity that was created, and our beers basically sold themselves. Today, Port Brewing represents 36 different SKUs, even though we've come and we've changed some of the things up. But for us, 36 SKUs for one brand is not even the high point for what we do. So here's our Abbey brand. The Abbey brand has always been imaginatively artistic, based around religious storytelling and a lot of images. And one of the things that I knew that was important for the Lost Abbey brand was to evoke a sense of Belgium or Belgian-inspired brewing, but we needed to do it with a sense of art. And I think previous to us coming on the market, one of the most highly imagistic brands that was out there was the guys from Canada at Unibrew. And I really appreciated the depth of artistry that their labels portrayed. And so when we created the Lost Abbey brand, we created a sense of 3 positions. One was the front label, or the artwork on the front. There was a backstory. I'm an English major from Northern Arizona University, so there's a lot of highly cool stories on the back. They're cool for me personally. And then what we called the liquid reward, basically what was in the bottle. So those were the 3 ways we were going to share our artistry with the consumer. The branding was supposed to be always very evocative and imagistic, so much so that sometimes we got in trouble. And a couple of years back, we had a label with a witch being burned on the front of it, and we got ourselves in trouble with the Wiccans of the world. So long story short, our branding would always be highly imagistic, and our tagline from day one was that we were for sinners and saints alike. So our original Lost Abbey brand started out with 4 beers. It rose up to 6 year-round beers, and now our core currently represents 5 year-round beers. Again, this is a lot like you would see business plans being written today. Belgian-inspired saisons, farmhouse lagers, and some Abbey ales. When we opened our doors, we went right to a cork-finished bottle. At that time, there were not a lot of domestic American producers using a cork-finished bottle. I see Naomi sitting over here from Allagash. They were one of the few people that was evoking that sense of old world, brown, cork-finished 750 milliliter bottles. Far more people doing it today, but our branding positioning was we wanted to look like an old world brand. We also had barrel strong, barrel wild, so we had a sour component from day one. Our original barrel warehouse had 100 oak barrels in it in 2006, and we used to tell people when they came on the tour that we were one of the largest collections of oak barrels on the West Coast, and 10 years ago we were. Today that wouldn't even be somebody's garage. So very much a different sense of today and yesterday in terms of what it means to be in the oak side of things. We felt that the Abbey brand had a chance to be on that white tablecloth. It had a chance to go into the wine list side of things and be a little bit higher price point. There was going to be a little bit more demand for this style of brewing because it wasn't going to be everywhere. Again, it wasn't a volume thing. But over the years, it's become a little bit more difficult to sell on that premise because so many other brewers have come to this market and said, this is a place that we think we can live, we think we can be in hyped beers and things like that. One of the most interesting things that we did in year 3 or so was that we ended up working with the crew at Russian River and the guys up at North Coast Brewing Company, and we created that 375 milliliter cork finished bottle right there. That bottle didn't even exist in the world. Even though lots of brewers in Belgium used the 750 milliliter cork finished bottle, that bottle shape and style didn't exist. And the 3 of us got together and created the mold for that specific bottle, which is now quite common out in the world. So we lost a little bit of equity in the sense that we created something and now it's being used by other people who are positioned themselves or have put their beers in a positioning not dissimilar to what we were doing back in the day. So now Lost Abbey brand represents about 54 SKUs this year alone. It is the highest skewed brand of the 3 that we have. I did want to point out that while we represent 3 brands, and I'm here to talk about 3 brands today, 2 of the 3 brands are showing positive growth trends, and one of them is experiencing a little bit of stagnation. So I wanted to actually point out that I'm not here to tell you that everything's rosy with respect to having 3 brands. So, lesson number 2, luck be a lady. This is the artistic side. I was quite lucky in that we met our artist, who again, his name is Sean Dominguez. He's very, very talented. I love working with him because he's brought a really amazing sense of artistry to the Lost Abbey brand, and I think that's been hugely important. What's been great about it is that I wasn't even personally looking for him. I needed an artist to help us tell our story, but he was already working with my partners at the pizza port level, and he just happened to come across and do this. I had no idea that he could pull off the artistry that we needed, but the first piece of art that he created for us, it was quite obvious to see that we were going to be okay. A lot of the art we use is pastoral, it's doom and gloom, it's very religious based in its sense of things. When we need to create a brand or a label for the Abbey side of things, it's quite simple to use the evil in the sense of good and evil in the world and biblical stories and things like that to create these amazing pieces of art. When we opened our doors, we created what we call this three-piece label. It has the sort of the Abbey sort of shape of almost like a stained glass window with a blank space and a cutout and then a backstory. That label, that style of label has been with us since day one. We just went through a major image rebranding at the brewery, but that positioning of the bottle has not gone away. Sean was also responsible for helping us create the Celtic cross image that you see in the middle down there on the bottom. And our Celtic cross actually is unique to us because it represents the 4 different ingredients that you find in the brewing process: barley, hops, yeast, and water. And we've chosen the Celtic symbol to tie our passion for brewing together. That piece has been with us since day one. So lots of great art from the day we opened our doors on the Abbey side. This Celtic cross has been on every single piece of beer that we've ever released, or every bottle, and it's definitely helped, in my mind, create a really iconic sense of the brand in terms of very much rewarding in the sense that you know that you're getting it. What did we do with that? Well, we worked really hard at the beginning to create hype for some very small batch beers. We've always told a great story with respect to the Abbey beers. I believe that maybe even we've told too much of a story because sometimes that can't be regurgitated at the sales level. But what I believe it's done over the years and 10 years that we've been in business is that it's allowed us to become a little brewery with a big reputation. I referenced that we're a 15,000 barrel a year brewery, but we're not a 15,000 barrel a year Lost Abbey brewery. We're a 15,000 barrels of total production. But we like to tell people, and lots of people come to visit the brewery thinking that we're this mega facility, but we're really not. So we have built something that was really important, and that is we built a lot of energy around a very, very small brand. How did we do it? Well, we allowed ourselves to create equity through having the two brands together. And one of the great things about having Port Brewing and Lost Abbey was that they worked together to create a synergy for us in total sales. The Port Brewing brand brought the level of velocity that we could expect from single bottles, but it outsold Abbey about 70-30. So about 70% of our production in the early years was Port Brewing brands, with 30% being Lost Abbey. But Abbey had better margins, so they worked together at about a 50-50 rate. So we got some great synergies from putting the two things on the street at the same time. Ultimately, it allowed us to knock on a lot of distributors' doors and say, we've got a great portfolio, this wide range of beers, won't you look at these things? So again, we focused on the storytelling, and a lot of that was focused on artistic level. We used the Port Brewing brands to create some velocity. That gave us predictable sales. It allowed us to open up new territorial growth. We had West Coast beers from a West Coast centered or West Coast centric facility. We also had these really amazing, imaginative Lost Abbey branded, highly storytelling based things. And it basically allowed us to create a platform for going to territories and places that we wanted to do. We do not have a distribution alignment. We are not in bud houses or only in Miller houses and things like that. But what most of our distribution these days is it's independence. A lot of our biggest wholesalers do not carry something from one of the major 3 breweries. We do have beers in some of those houses, and some of those decisions came from consolidation and things like that. We've been pretty blessed over the years because of the way we created these 2 portfolio pieces, that our sense of distribution was there weren't a lot of distributors in this country who wouldn't at least pick up the phone because of what we offered them. So that's where it says they would take our call. We always knew that if we needed to go to a great distributor in a great region, we thought we could get the meeting. That's been really great for us in the early years. It's been more difficult now that locals become such a big thing. So all of our distributors got both brands. So we now have beer in about 9 states, and every distributor that we're currently working with has our full portfolio of beers. As we move into a future concern representing 3 different brands, we're definitely wondering where some of those similarities or alignments work. So it says back up real quick. It says that we basically went through a phase where we created hub and spoke mentalities, and we basically have created a lot of these hubs. We've high spotted great beer markets, but we've never really spoked out in that sense. So this represents our footprint. You can see that we have nothing that touches each other than California, sort of Arizona and Colorado, but for the most part, we have this weird mix of where our beer goes. A lot of it had to do with wanting to work with a great distributor in a specific region or a great city. We launched in California 2006. We went to Arizona in 2007. We also took down Pennsylvania and Massachusetts in 2008 and basically have added about one state per year, although we really haven't added a whole lot of territory in the last 3 years. One of the things that we recognized was that as the market started changing in 2010, 2011, that adding new territory was not in our best interest because of the difficulties. So we've been a very small footprint brand for the last few years. Growth was easy at home. So we had the San Diego market exploding, opened our doors in 2006, and the whole runway was in front of us. Stone Distributing was great back in the day, and they still are today, but they were great early on because they didn't carry a lot of brands, and most of the brands that they were carrying were niche-driven. They were sort of offsetting from what they were representing of Stone Distributing. Today, they represent over 40 different brands. It's a much bigger book than it was when we got started. It was very easy to gain placements, both for Port Brewing and Abbey. But Chris wanted me to sort of explain why it is or how it is that we worked with the multiple brands. We typically promoted the Abbey brand more than Port Brewing because Port Brewing was a very simple sense of West Coast stylings, and that story was being told at a high level by the guys at Stone, Ballast, Green Flash, and lots of other places. West Coast styling is something that a lot of consumers could easily wrap their head around. So we spent most of our time focusing on the Abbey side because we wanted to develop what the Abbey brand was, and there wasn't a lot of American, Belgian-inspired brands at that point. We found a great amount of competitive success, which allowed our story to be told at a national level, and that really helped us in terms of developing that sense that our brand was bigger than it was. And for the first 8 years we were in business, we had no sales team. And of course, as we all know today, having no sales team is almost brand suicide. So what happened? 2010, I referenced, we had a pretty big pedagogical shift in San Diego. A lot of new breweries came online starting in 2010, and that trends to a national level as well. Places like Boston and Chicago and Philadelphia, where we had some nice share of mind with our distributors, exploded, and lots of local brands. Specifically, Chicago was a tough market for us. Chicago saw a lot of new breweries come online, and our ability to compete in those markets where there's still a ton of great beer being sold was a little bit compromised. So it says here, local became tough and fresh became even tougher. So we spent a lot of time from 2010 through 2015 not doing a whole lot. We didn't really react because one of the things that was really key for me personally was we were still in the business phase of developing a heritage for our brands or a sense of what our legacies were, our beers that you could rely on. And we didn't really look at that point to shift, even though a lot of breweries around us were starting to. And a lot of breweries were starting to understand that you had to start cutting and pasting and doing things in order to be relevant. But we were a small brand, again, single bottle formatting, so a lot of our cutting and pasting didn't have to occur in the same way. We weren't slotted, we didn't have seasonal SKU programs and things like that. But in 2015, we had a pretty good idea and we launched this third brand called the Hop Concept. So why did we do that? Well, there was this sense around the brewery that a lot of people were creating opportunities for their brands with new. And one of the things that I personally didn't want to do was go back and retool or cut or do things to some of the legacy brands that we had been working with, but felt that we needed to offer our distributors a chance at something that was going to be beneficial to both of us. So I stuck to this sense of heritage for both the Abbey and some of the Port Brewing brands. And in doing so, we thought that the best way to go after this was to launch a whole new brand. Seemed kind of good at the time. So lesson 3, the Hop Concept, fresh, local, or both. We know that it's very difficult to do both. There are a lot of breweries, specifically in this town, that are draft only, very small scale brands that are way more nimble, can keg a beer on Monday, self-deliver it on Tuesday, and reload that same keg on Friday. And that was a very challenging issue with respect to IPA and IPA in this town. I think Nielsen published a data point earlier in the year that 50% of the craft beer sold in San Diego right now, or we're really close to approaching that, is IPA. So this is IPA, sort of IPA-ville, and you have to participate in that conversation. I was at the Toronado in San Diego one day, and I was standing up there looking at the 50 beers on tap, and there were lots of new IPAs on that wall, which came from great producers, people that I know and respect. But I had no idea how I was supposed to choose which one of those new beers to drink because I didn't know anything about them. There are so many new beers that come to the market every day. And that's when it hit me that one of the things that we had an opportunity to do with respect to both the consumer level, the distribution level, and the production level was to create something that basically told you what you were getting. So we developed this line of beers called the Hop Concept. This was the first set of beers out the door, the Hop Freshener series, and it was taste and smell. What am I tasting? What am I smelling? The very first bottle in the list is dank and sticky. The second one was citrus and piney, lemon and grassy, followed by tropical and juicy. What that basically did was it allowed us to send beer to our distributors, and their representatives, the people that had just gone to the market, didn't even have to sample it to tell the retailer what they should expect the beer to be. If the consumer didn't know what they were getting, they knew that dank and sticky, they knew what citrus and piney was. So that was an opportunity to connect with our retailers, our consumers, and distributors without having to really tell a big, deep backstory. Totally different than anything we had done up until that point. We also launched this brand figuring that given Skimageddon and the way things were going, that the potential for this to only be a 2 to 3 year brand in terms of life expectancy was very possible. We actually built the brand thinking that someone might actually want to acquire it and move on with it in a way at a national level or even on a higher regional level because we couldn't get to those places. So lots of things about the Hop Freshener and Hop Concept brand were built without a huge backstory. It was about the consumer and the retail and the distribution channel, totally different than anything we had previously done. Today, it's 24 SKUs. Basically, it's going to be 6 to 8 different releases per year. And again, we're still in a single bottle formatting. Chris, I know I'm going to run over by a couple minutes, if that's okay. I'm announcing it before. Good. All right. So Hop Freshener was year 1. That was 2015. 2016, we actually brought back another set of 4 beers under the Hop Concept moniker. And these are beers that really emphasize the dry hopping components. So what we had was taste and smell. If you have no idea how citrus and piney tastes or it smells, this is a great vehicle. If you're into Galaxy hops or Equinox or Mosaic, now you know that we can provide that for you. This was Mosaic and Eureka. If you were to buy this, you should be able to tell from the aroma profile that this is what Mosaic and Eureka hops do. Again, we're talking and we're telling a story, but that story doesn't have anything to do with the dude that made it, the guy on the platform, the guy that ran the bottling line, any of that. It's more of a label than it is a true brand. But I think we've got this inherent sense of very fresh and simple, and the beer has done very well in terms of its velocity and has great pull because we've delivered one thing. When you see it, it's fresh, and we'll move on to the next one. It was expensive. We spent somewhere between $50,000 to $75,000 across the entire launch of both the Hop Concept and the Hop Freshener beers with respect to some of the design, the packaging, and things like that. But we didn't have to hire a sales team to sell it, and it would have been even more expensive if we had gone into having a bigger website, which we chose not to do so. So lesson 5, there it is. Storytelling is fucking hard. This year alone, and that's up to October, we have represented 114 different SKUs into the market. So I'm personally responsible for Skimageddon. Thank you very much. And in the scheme of things, we've had to hire a new brand manager, someone to work with our distributor. We now have a staff of 4 salespeople, 3 of which are in Southern California, and 1 of which handles Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And we don't have enough volume in our other markets to potentially really, truly work with our distributor partners, and that's something that as we move forward, we're going to have to look at. 70% of all of our dollars are still sold in California, which I think is pretty awesome given that local is keen, and some of our best distributor partners are here in California as well. So what are we looking at? We have our 2 largest wholesalers here in the state. We have online sales capabilities. California is awesome. You can do direct to consumer. And we also know that tasting rooms are a big portion of what we're looking at in the future. And while we don't have a tremendous sales team, we actually now have a full-time social media person who's in charge of creating content. We're up to 64,000 followers on Instagram. So if we're talking about brand messaging and really creating images, that's a way that we can connect with the consumer every day at a very, very low level of cost. And we control that message, so that's massively important in our world. Number 6, being nimble feels very suicidal, and I only say that because of the amount of effort we've had to put in the last year to really go through it. We stuck to a notion of heritage. We wanted to create a true sense of this brand is this, these are our roots. But we needed to refresh, and we went through earlier this year and we refreshed the Lost Abbey labels, again, kept the 3-part label, did that in-house, so we were able to keep some of the costs down in the scheme of things. We are going to be canning some port brewing beers for the first time. So a 6-pack of beer will be available. That's going to create a new volume or velocity product that we haven't had. We're actually subtracting SKUs. We're working with our distribution partners to go over what it is that they can and can't sell, because I know that they've all become bloated. A lot of our distributors, and I love you, hi, our distributors have got a lot of product on the floor, and that's becoming an issue for them in terms of management, wholesale, warehousing, and all that. So we're trying to work to not be part of that at the highest level. And the biggest question for me is, how do we continue to stand out? And at the Abbey level, specifically 10 years into it, where do we get heritage? How do we not create a whole bunch of new things that are shiny and new that maybe in 5 years' time won't be relevant anymore? So that's always a big question mark with respect to the brands, is what is the premise for the vehicle, the story, and things like that. And then I guess the sort of the bottom one here, we spend a lot of time on intellectual property. I talked earlier about this, but intellectual property is key. And we chase a lot of that, and it's tough across 3 brands. So if you're thinking about doing this, just make sure that you understand that there's a lot of work that has to go into making sure that the brand is going to have value in the future. Here's the conclusions. We did build the brewery with 2 brands. We knew that that was going to be something that was going to be a strategic advantage for us. And it was. For many, many years, it was absolutely an advantage. We had 2 separate brands. You almost didn't know they came from the same facility. The consumer didn't necessarily care. They were both great sets of beers. Created great synergies. Yeah, it was very difficult to manage. And now we have 3 brands. Well, because we're stupid, right? That's not the easiest thing to do. But what 3 brands has done is really focused our energies on positioning and understanding how each brand needs to behave and what it means to have those 3 brands. We're currently considering more brands because that's how stupid we are. And it seems like there's an opportunity to have some very small batch brands that maybe don't go into distribution, and that's a key thing these days. Again, now we're talking about full-time social media, graphic designer, and still working very hard to tell our story. And I come to work every day, and one of the biggest issues is, where do we fit in the future? Where does our heritage come from? We're 10 years in. I've spent time with breweries in Belgium that are 150 years old. They clearly have a level of heritage that we don't have. But now, many of the things that we launched our brand on, the premises of Belgian-inspired and West Coast and barrel and sour, it's a sea of imitation. Everybody's doing that these days. So I kind of want to point out that our work is never done. And it says here that they're always painting the bridge. There's this very large bridge to the south of us called the Coronado Bay Bridge. It's blue. And they basically start at one end, and they paint, and when they get to the other end, they turn around and go back. Guess what? They never stop painting the bridge, right? So our job is to keep painting the bridge. And it's not the easiest thing to do with respect to managing and working with the distributors, but if we keep painting and we keep making sure that the bridge is maintained, our beers in the market will be fine. Thank you.
So, Tomme, we don't have much time for questions, so I'll just toss you one right now. Your last point there about always painting the bridge.
Yes.
Yeah, you're always painting the bridge. A lot of brands are always painting the bridge. I think sometimes as you paint the bridge, it's just the different brush that you use to paint it with. So going forward, as you look out, a couple years down the road for you guys, how do you decide which brushes to use and when?
So it's been interesting because we just went through probably the most interesting expansion, I think, in the history of the beer business. And I don't even know how to describe the last 5 years or 10 years. I don't know that we're ever going to see the explosion of growth and brand positioning and movements and cutting and slashings and new and old. I think one of the things that a lot of us are hopeful in the future with respect to which brush to choose is that the business settles down a little bit and then some of the predictability comes back into what we're supposed to be doing. I don't even remember Jackson Pollock, but throw the paint at the side of the building behind the airplane and the jet and let it stick and figure it out. There's a lot of, I think, breweries throwing stuff at the side of the barn, just trying to survive and figure it out. But wouldn't it be great if we could go back to building some of the heritage and pieces, I think, that we really wanted as a brand.
Awesome.
Or as brands.
Awesome. Thank you, Tomme.
Cheers, bud. Thank you.